Chapter 42, New Worlds Within. A lot of names in this one I'm probably going to butcher. Sorry ahead of time. The microscope was a product of the same age that made the telescope. But while Copernicus and Galileo have become popular heroes, prophets of modernity, Hooke and Leeuwenhoek, their counterparts in the microscopic world, have been relegated to the pantheon of the specialized sciences. Copernicus and Galileo play leading roles in the much publicized battle between science and religion. Hooke and Leeuwenhoek did not. We do not know who invented the microscope. The leading candidate is Zacharias Janssen, an obscure spectacle maker of Middelburg. We do know that the microscope, like eyeglasses and the telescope, was in use long before the principles of optics were understood, and it was probably as accidental as the telescope. It could hardly have been devised by anyone eager to peer into a microscopic world still unimagined. Soon after the first telescopes were made, people simply tried using them to enlarge objects nearby. In the beginning, the same Italian word, occhialino, or the Italian perspiculum, served for both telescope and microscope. Galileo himself tried using his telescope as a microscope. With this tube, Galileo reported to a visitor in Florence in November 1614, I have seen flies which look as big as lambs, and have learned that they are covered over with hair and have very pointed nails, by means of which they keep themselves up and walk on glass, although hanging feet upwards by inserting the point of their nails in the pores of the glass. He discovered to his dismay that while a telescope focused on the stars needed to be only 2 feet long, to magnify small objects nearby required a tube 2 to 3 times that length. As early as 1625, a member of the Academy of the Lynxes, the physician naturalist John Faber, 1574 to 1629, had a name for the new device. The optical tube, it has pleased me to call, after the model of the telescope, a microscope, because it permits a view of minute things. The same suspicions that made Galileo's critics unwilling to look through his telescope and then reluctant to believe what they saw also cursed the microscope. The telescope was obviously useful in battle, but there were no battles yet where the microscope could help. In the absence of a science of optics, sensible people were especially wary of optical illusions, deceptionis visus. This medieval distrust of all optical devices was the great obstacle to the science of optics. As we have seen, it was believed that any device standing between the senses and the object to be sensed could only mislead the God-given faculties. And to a certain extent, the crude microscopes in those days confirmed their suspicions. Chromatic and spherical aberration still produced fuzzy images. In 1665, Robert Hooke, with an E, 1635 to 1703, published his Micrographia, an enticing miscellany expounding his theory of light and color, and his theories of combustion and respiration, along with a description of the microscope with its uses. But the widespread suspicions of optical illusions would plague Hooke. At first, the new world he claimed to see through his lenses was the butt of ridicule. For example, in Thomas Shadwell's popular farce, The Virtuoso, 1676. What Galileo's Sidereus Nuncius had done for the telescope and its heavenly vistas, Hooke's Micrographia now did for the microscope. Just as Galileo did not invent the telescope, neither did Hooke invent the microscope, but what he described seeing in his compound microscope awakened learned Europe to the wonderful world within. 57 amazing illustrations drawn by Hooke himself revealed for the first time the eye of a fly, the shape of a bee's stinging organ, the anatomy of a flea and a louse, the structure of feathers, and the plant-like form of molds. When he discovered the honeycomb structure of cork, he said it was made of cells. Frequently reprinted, Hooke's illustrations remained in textbooks into the 19th century. But you could Google those. Just as a telescope had brought together the Earth and the most distant heavenly bodies into a single scheme of thought, now microscopic vistas revealed a minuscule world, surprisingly like that seen on a large scale every day. In his Historia Insectorum Generalis, Jan Swammerdam, 1637 to 1680, showed that insects, like the higher animals, possessed an intricate anatomy and did not reproduce by spontaneous generation. In his microscope, he saw insects developing as man did, by epigenesis, the gradual development of one organ after another. Still, belief in other forms of spontaneous generation survived. As we shall see, it was not until Louis Pasteur's brilliant experiments with fermentation in the 19th century and his practical application of his ideas for the preservation of milk that the dogma ceased to be scientifically respectable. The microscope opened dark continents never before entered, and in many ways easy to explore. The great sea voyages had required large capital, organizing genius, talents of leadership, and the charisma of a Prince Henry or a Columbus, a Magellan or a Gama. Astronomic exploring required the coordinated observations of people in many places, but a lone man anywhere with a microscope could venture for the first time where there were neither experienced navigators nor skilled pilots. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, 1632 to 1723, with his microscope, pioneered this new science of otherworldly exploration. In Delft, where he was born, his father made baskets to pack the famous Delft ware for the world market. Antony himself made a good living by selling silk, wool, cotton, buttons, and ribbons to the city's comfortable burghers, and had a substantial income as head of the city council, inspector of weights and measures, and court surveyor. He was a close friend of Jan Vermeer, and on the painter's death was appointed trustee of Vermeer's bankrupt estate. He never attended a university, and during his whole 90 years, he left the Netherlands only twice, journeying once to Antwerp and once to England. Leeuwenhoek did not know Latin and could only write in the vernacular Dutch of his native Delft. But the modern instrument-aided experience of the senses was translingual. No longer did one need Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic to join the community of scientists. That age of bitter commercial rivalry between the Dutch and the British for treasures of the East Indies saw the vigorous collaboration in science. Even while the guns of British and Dutch admirals were firing at each other, British and Dutch scientists were cordially exchanging information and sharing new scientific vistas. An international community of science was growing. In 1668, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London published an extract from an Italian learned journal, telling how an Italian lens maker, Eustachio Divini, 1610 to 1685, using a microscope, had discovered an animal lesser than any of those seen hitherto. 5 years later, in the heat of the Anglo-Dutch naval wars, Henry Oldenburg, who was born in Germany, educated at the University of Utrecht, and was now in London publishing the Philosophical Transactions, received a letter from the Dutch anatomist Regnier de Graaf, 1641 to 1673. That it may be the more evident to you that the humanities and science are not yet banished from among us by the clash of arms, I am writing to tell you that a certain most ingenious person here, named Leeuwenhoek, has devised microscopes which far surpass those which we have hitherto seen, manufactured by Eustachio Divini and others. The enclosed letter from him, wherein he describes certain things which he has observed more accurately than previous authors, will afford you a sample of his work. And if it please you, and you would test the skill of this most diligent man and give him encouragement, then pray send him a letter containing your suggestions and proposing to him more difficult problems of the same kind. With this encouragement, Leeuwenhoek was drawn into a community of science where he enjoyed 50 years of communication with a world of unseen colleagues. Careful drapers like Leeuwenhoek were in the habit of using a low-power magnifying glass to inspect the quality of cloth. His first microscope was a small lens, ground by hand from a glass globule and clamped between two perforated metal plates, through which an object could be viewed. Attached was an adjustable device for holding the specimen. All his work would be done with simple microscopes using only a single lens system. Leeuwenhoek ground some 550 lenses, of which the best had a linear magnifying power of 500 and a resolving power of 1/1,000,000th of a meter. In the traditions of alchemy, of instrument making, and of cartography, Leeuwenhoek was secretive. What visitors to his shop saw, he declared, was nothing compared with what he himself had seen with the superior lenses that he was not at liberty to show them. His fellow townsmen called him a magician, but this did not please him. He remained wary of the eager visitor from abroad who, he said, was much rather inclined to deck himself out with my feathers than to offer me a helping hand. The Royal Society encouraged Leeuwenhoek to report his findings in 190 letters. Since he had no systematic program of research, a letter was his perfect format for reporting his unexpected glimpses of the innards of anything and everything. Some of his first chance observations proved to be his most startling. If Galileo was so excited by distinguishing stars in the Milky Way and 4 new satellites of the planet Jupiter, how much more exciting to discover a universe in every drop of water. Once Leeuwenhoek had a microscope, he began looking for something to do with it. In September 1674, out of curiosity, he filled a glass vial with some greenish cloudy water, which the country folk called honeydew, from a marshy lake 2 miles outside of Delft, and under his magnifying glass he found very many small animalcules. He then turned his microscope on a drop of pepper water. I now saw very plainly that these were little eels or worms lying all huddled up together and wriggling, just as if you saw with the naked eye a whole tub full of very little eels in water, with the eels a-squirming among one another, and the whole water seemed to be alive with these multifarious animalcules. This was for me, among all the marvels I've discovered in nature, the most marvelous of all. And I must say for my part that no more pleasant sight has ever yet come before my eye than these many thousands of living creatures seen all alive in a little drop of water, moving among one another, each several creature having its own proper motion. In his famous letter 18 to Royal Society, October 9th, 1678, he concluded that, quote, these little animals were, to my eye, more than 10,000 times smaller than the animalcule which Swammerdam has portrayed and called by the name of water flea or water louse, which you can see alive and moving in water with the bare eye. Like Balboa speculating on the extent of his great southern ocean, or Galileo delighting in the new infinity of the stars, so Leeuwenhoek luxuriated in the minuteness of these tiny creatures and their infinitely vast populations. He put into a slender glass tube an amount of water as big as a millet seed, marked off 30 divisions on the tube, quote, and I then bring it before my microscope by means of 2 silver or copper springs, which I have attached thereto, to be able to push it up or down. The visitor to his shop at the time was amazed. Now, supposing that this gentleman really saw 1,000 animalcules in a particle of water 1/30th of the bigness of a millet seed, and that would be 30,000 living creatures in a quantity of water as big as a millet seed, and consequently 2,730,000 living creatures in 1 drop of water. Not using commas makes it hard to read numbers. Yet, Leeuwenhoek added, there were much smaller creatures not revealed to the visitor, but which I could see by means of other glasses and a different method, which I keep for myself alone. It is no wonder that those who read these reports were troubled by doubts. Some accuse him, quote, of seeing more with his imagination than with his magnifying glasses. To persuade the Royal Society, he produced signed testimonials of eyewitnesses, not fellow scientists, but simple, respectable citizens, notaries public, the pastor of the English congregation in Delft, and others. Each called himself a testis oculatus, who had seen the little animals with his own very eyes. Having discovered the world of bacteria, Leeuwenhoek went on to dignify its inhabitants. Contradicting Aristotle's dogmas about the lower animals, he declared that each of the animalcules had its full complement of the bodily organs needed for the life it led. Therefore, there was no reason to believe that all the small animals, insects, and intestinal worms would arise spontaneously out of filth, dung, dirt, and decaying organic matter. Rather, as the Bible hinted, each reproduced after its kind and was the offspring of a predecessor of the same species. When Leeuwenhoek sent the report of his microscopic observations of human semen to the Royal Society, he discreetly apologized. And if your lordship should consider that these observations may disgust or scandalize the learned, I earnestly beg your lordship to regard them as private and to publish or destroy them as your lordship thinks fit. Some years earlier, William Harvey, in his De Generatione, 1651, had described the egg as the sole source of new life. The prevailing notion was that semen provided nothing more than fertilizing vapors. When Leeuwenhoek, who equated motility with life, saw the lively spermatozoa swimming about, he went to the other extreme and gave them the dominant role in creating new life. An irrepressible explorer, he went down many dead ends, explaining pepper's pungent taste by its spiny microscopic texture and human growth by the performation of organs in the sperm. But he also opened vistas into microbiology, embryology, histology, entomology, botany, and crystallography. His well-earned election as a Fellow of the Royal Society of London, February 8, 1680, delighted him beyond measure. It signaled a new world of scientists, international and unacademic, where knowledge would be advanced not only by the traditional custodians of knowledge. Mere mechanics, amateurs, would come into their own.